Howdy of you delicious people. I'm here today to review House of Wax. So, I never really thought that I was probably ever going to review this film, but now that I watched it, because, I don't know, it just kept, popping up on my radar of me just going and consistently going through a number of apps, it just continued to pop up, so I'm like somebody in the ether is telling me that I need to see this movie. Somebody in the world is telling me that I need to go and rewatch this because I had watched it a while ago once before. Going in here, realizing that The House of Wax is a remake film. Some people may not know, and maybe going into searching for this as maybe quite possibly the original. Maybe people are intrigued with the original film as well as this remake. A lot of people might have gone into this film just because of certain stars in this movie. Maybe like a Jared Padalecki, which of course people would probably know from Supernatural. Uh, Alicia Cuthbert, which a lot of people might know from movies like The Girl Next Door and also The Ranch. And also a quite possible star named Paris Hilton that people might be aware of her. Going into this film, we really have a very slow start to this film. It really does go into this point of just going come on already. Let's get going. Let's get killing somebody in this movie. Please, someone die. But then eventually, once we get seemingly almost an hour into this film, then we actually go into, okay, here we go. This is where we're going to get to the point of these people getting to this seemingly populated town, but we end up finding out that really the population of this town is not exactly the numbers of what you would think. But anyways, we go on into this movie, and I really do think that they give us a little trickle here and there of knowledge of the villain of this movie, but I honestly do not think that it's good enough. I really would have liked us to be able to have had some much more flashback things of this town. We could have had a whole flashbacking scene just kind of pointing out to us eventually, once the villain is revealed, that it would have been nice to just get a flashback of what happened eventually to this town. And you could have easily done it in a montaging thing where it was just kind of quickly kind of showcasing what was to happen amongst this town and what was to happen with the people of the town. And villain or villains or whichever, however we want to break that down. Because maybe the entire town is haunted. Maybe the entire town had decided to have any outlander or outcast or whatever go and be killed off. And that could be a way of going about doing this. So, going into this movie, I think that it is kind of eerie and or creepy in some moments, where especially we end up having them try to rescue people, and man, does that go horribly awry. Really, there are characters that eventually we find out are far too gone, and that just, it's and plus also we end up, when this movie does eventually catch up to itself, and actually decide to get much more exciting, we end up having it to where we are to see a lot of gruesome takedowns, or a lot of gruesome stabbings, or a lot of gruesome ways of doing this film. And I'm man, why couldn't we have seen that a lot more throughout this film? Why couldn't we have these people consistently on edge? Why couldn't we have been much more surprised with what's going on in this film? And then instead of just going on and just being here's the little cool parts that they did, but now we're back to the same old song and dance, like how basically this movie eventually gets to. Really, yeah, the creepiness of this movie, the creep factor. This movie just kind of reminds me of like Jeepers Creepers. A lot of the first one, especially where we have like Justin Long, who is all of a sudden like finding the Jeepers Creepers character and finding his catacomb or cave of all of these bodies that are just held up for the Jeepers Creepers character, and we have Justin Long who's just like, oh my god, and then he ends up walking away. Like that kind of moment is kind of what happens within this movie, to where we eventually end up finding out that things aren't what they seem. Things aren't what they seem throughout this entire film. I kind of thought that we were to have, uh, like, I thought we were like this movie kind of gives it to you of like an illusion kind of movie where you have to kind of double check things and then realize that, oh, okay, like, so this is a much more presented movie and a much more put together film, and I think I can really enjoy this movie for those aspects of just giving you like the assumption of something, and then it like pulling the wool under you, to where you're just like, oh, okay, so like, especially once we actually get to the town and it seems like the town is really busy and that the town is really popping. um but anyways, I think I've talked about this in very cryptic like sense for as long as I can, because reasonably, like, this film is kind of like, it kind of feels like the generic horror movie as well, with the exclusion of eventually what they do with these people, eventually what happens with the people, which goes into a very much gory like factor. But with that said, I am going to go into spoiler time. Let's dust out that double five to otherwise say that it's about that time again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. Immediately when I go into this film, like, I think reasonably there have been consistent apps and things that I've gone into where really it had kept saying that this movie had been seen by a lot of people, or this movie had been fairly popular. And so, like, I was thinking, I'm like, well, something in the ether is just telling me that I should probably just watch this film. It's been such a long time since I've seen it. And so, I'm really looking at a lot of these actors. I'm like, good God, they look so young. Like, especially Jared Padalecki, which I've seen him in, like, Supernatural, like, through a lot of those seasons, and like Friday the 13th, and to just kind of see him here where he's like so young in this movie, it's kind of interesting to see a younger version of an actor that I know. So let's push on to spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we can spoil this movie. So we end up having this group of kids who are all on a road trip. Carly, Nick, Paige, Wade, and Dalton and Blake. So we end up having all these kids who are going on a road trip. We eventually have seemingly both Paige and Blake, seemingly through us looking at them from another car. It seems like Paige is giving Blake a PJ, but Paige just mentioned that she ended up dropping her lip balm, and they're like, yeah, sure, uh-huh. Yeah, I'm sure you did. So we eventually have this group mention that they are purposely going to some game, but they have to get like tickets for the game on the last minute. So I think that these people are just joyriding, and really they hope to eventually get to this game. But if they don't get to the game, well, it is what it is. Luckily, they didn't spend money on those tickets ahead of time, because man, what a waste of money that would have been. So we go along to have these characters go on a road trip, and then they eventually decide to pull off to go and rest for the night, and they all decide to go tenting. So they all go tenting, and so, or camping, or whatever you call it. Whatever you call it, you there, you in the camera. Uh, so they all go tenting, and so we end up having a vehicle who ends up putting on its high beams, some kind of truck of sorts, and and it enters the camp. And so we end up having, of course, uh, where we end up having Carly, who is kind of assessing, like, well, like maybe we're in his territory and we didn't realize it, and we end up having Wade, who mentions like well, no, like if anything, like we would have seen a sign, no trespassing. We would have seen a gate somewhere. None of that is happening. None of that is true. So we eventually have it to where Nick eventually goes and takes a bottle and flings it at this car, because we end up having numerous times where both Wade and Blake are demanding that this person turn off their lights or talk to them or whatever. And so the driver does not do so. We eventually have it to where Nick ends up flinging a beer to hit this car in one of the lights, and so we end up having this car who ends up driving off. Eventually, I'm going to have a problem with this, but we'll get there. I'm going to have a problem with something within this movie, because when you find out who the actual driver is, I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, shouldn't this person have been able to easily do a thing? And I'll talk about that when we get to that point. So, you'll understand when I get to that point. So, we go on and we have this guy's light who is now damaged, and so he ends up driving off. And then they think nothing of it. They think that, hey, how about we just go back to sleep and see what the next day gives us. So we end up having Blake, who is to wake everybody up, throwing a football to their tent. I'm skipping a lot of the generic stuff where people go into dialogue, because a lot of the dialogue doesn't actually matter. Like, to me, I guess some important things could be that we have a conversation between Carly and Paige where Carly is to tell Paige if Paige had told Blake that she was pregnant. And we end up having Paige who's like, well, maybe I'm just late. Like, normally I'm pretty, like, I know that I've been kind of late before, and, like, I think, like, everything's gonna just work itself out. Because horror movie, it might just work itself out. Sadly enough. So, we also end up having, really Nick, who is kind of the buzzkill of this group. We end up having Nick, who is to kind of consistently go after Carly, and Nick is Nick is maybe bitter that his life didn't turn out like how fantastic that Carly is with her life going. Because we end up having Carly, who is, I guess, desperately trying to go to, like, try to figure out how to make funds to go to college so that way she won't have to do things like flipping burgers or whatever for the rest of her life. So we go on with all that blah, 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 blah dialogue, all that blah, blah, blah. So we have it to where they are all waking up. We end up finding out that it seems that we are to realize that while they are to go and check their cars, we end up having Wade's car, who is Jared Padalecki. We end up having Wade, who is to realize that his part of his car is broken. I don't remember what it was called. He probably said it numerous times, but I don't remember exactly what it was called. So we end up having Wade mention that this thing was brand new and there's no way that this thing could be broken. And so forcibly we end up having Carly and Paige who keep getting a big fat whiff of some disgusting smell. And so we end up having it to where Carly and Paige end up going and trying to investigate what that smell is, because every once in a while they keep getting hit with this smell that makes no sense to them. So we end up having Carly and Paige walking along, and so we end up having Carly who ends up going and falling seemingly down this hill like thing. So we end up having Carly who ends up diving hands first into this roadkill spot, like a whole spot just full of dead animal and all kinds of things, blood, a fruit basket, I don't know, it's all kind of random, like garbage and junk and crap. So we end up having Carly who is like, I'm stuck, like I can't get out of here, like and so we end up having her screaming loud enough to where eventually the rest of the group goes and tries to get close enough to figure out how to help her get out of this. And so we eventually have some hillbilly, some. I'm trying to find exactly. He's just called Roadkill Driver. He's just called Roadkill Driver in the credits. He doesn't have a name. Come on. So, we end up having this Roadkill Driver that just arrives to fling some dead animal carcasses, and it seems like there is some hand that is in with all of this stuff. So we end up having Jared, who is to, or Wade, who is to mention, like, hey, like, what's that hand doing on all this collection? And we end up having the Roadkill Driver, who ends up going and walking over and pulling the hand out to just be like, dude, it's just a prosthetic. Like, man, like, toss it off to the side. Like it's not a human being. No. So we end up having Wade, who ends up helping Carly from out of her roadkill spectacular, and so we end up having Wade helping her out of this, and so we end up having Nick, who ends up giving Carly his shirt, and so we have this ooh moment where we end up having Carly, who ends up taking off her shirt to go and throw on Nick's tank top, and so now Nick is shirtless. For a lot of the women out there, for a lot of the women out there, bravo to that. So, anyways, we go on, and but I got the like we got to see almost topless Carly, so bravo to that. And plus, also, we eventually get to see Paris eventually doing a dance for us somewhere in the movie of this, but to each their own. It is what it is with that one. For you One Night in Paris lovers, bizarrely, I don't know. Maybe that does it for you. I don't know. But going on to this movie, so we go on in here, and so we end up having it to where Wade, right in front of like this roadkill guy and in front of the group, we end up having Wade, who is trying to figure out how he can be able to get his car piece, his God, whatever it is. I don't remember what the piece was. I don't really care. It is whatever. It's one of those. Oh God, I don't remember what the piece was. I don't really care, but it is what it is. So we end up having like Wade talking to the rest of the group about that he needs to get that piece for his car, and we have it to where Wade is thinking about keeping himself here with the car, and we end up having the group who is saying like, well, no, like if anything, we can like drive you into town and get you that the car piece, and then like you'll be fine. And we end up having it to where Wade's like, no, like then you guys will miss the game. And so we have it to where Wade at first is telling the group to go on without him, and then get him the car piece, and then come back, and then get the get the piece for him, so that way he can go and drive off. So we go on, and we end up having the roadkill drivers like, well, hey, like if anything, like the town is like just up ahead, like I can drive you there. And we end up having Wade is like, really? Like you'll do that? And the roadkill guy is like, yeah, sure. Like I'd be more than happy to help you out. So we end up having Wade, who ends up going along with this roadkill hillbilly-ish like person, and we end up having Carly go along with him. And so we end up having the group all decide to drive off to eventually go to the game, but then they decide to turn back around because it's just the wrong thing to leave them behind. So we go on and have Wade and Carly with Roadkill guy, and this guy is becoming more suspicious as the minutes are long. So we end up having Roadkill guy, who is to pop out his knife because it seems that Carly is looking at it, and he's like, "Hey, like, yeah, like it's just a trick of the trade. It's just a tool of the trade." Like, and we end up having Roadkill driver, who ends up tossing the knife onto his dashboard. And so we end up having it to where the Roadkill guy is to eventually stop the car because he was driving along and noticed right where they were supposed to drive to, this location now has a water bit that is separating uh, the road, to where there's like a watery hole that is to separate between the road to get this guy further on into the town. So we end up having the roadkill driver is like, well, hey man, like I could probably just drive around or figure out some other way to get there. And we end up having Wade and Carly, who's like, well, I think we've been like driving long enough. Like if anything, like if this is just a quicker way to get through this town, like if anything, let's just get out now and then we'll just walk into town. And we have it to where the roadkill driver is like, well, hey, but this is just like I can just get you, and like they're just like, dude, like I think we've spent enough time with you. Let's get out of here and just go and walk to just get to town. And we end up having it to where like the roadkill driver's like, dude, like I like really like did a kindness for you, and like look how you're treating me. So we end up having both Carly and Wade get out of the car to go and rock pedal their way into town for this water gap. So we eventually have Wade and Carly that eventually go into town to see, for the most part, that it seems that this town, for bulk of it, feels deserted. So we end up having Wade, who ends up making it to a gas station slash garage slash repair looking place. And so we end up having it to where reasonably Carly and Wade are just like, well, like, is it going to be possible that like we're going to be able to get the piece that we need? And like, is like this place going to even be open today? Like, are we going to be able to get the piece in time, kind of thing? So we have both Carly and Wade decide, well, how about we just go into the church and see if anyone is in there? Well, sadly enough, we end up having Carly and Wade, who are to interrupt a funeral that is going on. We end up having a guy named Bo, who is to go and have a funeral being done. And it seems like he is burying a family member of his. I believe it's his mother. So we end up having Bo coming out and really ticked off at both of these people for interrupting his the funeral proceedings, and we end up having Wade, who's like, dude, I just came into town just to get a car part and I'm Audi 5000. We end up having Bo, who's like, dude, you interrupt a funeral for a car part? Like, how much of a piece of crap are you? We end up having it to where Wade is like, I'm sorry. Like I just needed to get this piece to get out of your hair. And so, do you know anybody that actually works at this gas station or this repair place that can help me? And we end up having Bo, who's like, well, you're in luck. Like, you're talking to the right guy. So we have Wade and Carly, who end up going to this guy's chop shop or this guy's repair place, this guy's gas and car repair place, whatever it's called. So we end up having Carly and Wade looking through and really Wade can't find the right car piece. We end up having him looking through a bunch of different ones and kind of seeing which one would just best just do the job, even though it's not exactly the right fit, uh, the right part for the car. But he's just like, maybe it'll just do. Maybe it'll be fine. So here's one thing I'm gonna put a pin in that for a second, because there's a very odd opening to this movie. So we bizarrely end up having in this film we end up having a kid that is eating cereal on his like in his baby chair, where it seems that he has like a it's one of those where you end up having like a person being like propped into the chair, like slid into the chair, because there's like a little table in front of him, and like this thing is pretty well set up to uh like also have another kid come in. And so we end up having one kid who is really nice, but then we end up having another kid who is seemingly viciously like angry and upset and whatever. And so we end up having that kid who is now to be like strapped into his high chair. Yeah, there we go, high chair. We end up having him being like leather strapped in and also like duct taped and all kinds of things to get this kid to just sit in this high chair to where he is to go and get his food, I guess just forcibly fed to him, because this kid is just really just uncontrollable. And we also have it where it seems that we have the mother who is to go and start putting, I guess, like a wax thing into some sculpt, and we end up having the angry kid who is to end up knocking the sculpt into the floor, which it ends up breaking. So we have that bizarrish intro of this movie. So going back to this moment, so we end up having Bo, who is to go to the repair shop, and we end up having Wade telling Bo that this uh, God, I'm trying to think of the like I'm consistently trying to think of what the part is. Because I know, like, I've seen it on vacuums a lot of times, like vacuums that'll break consistently. Uh, like, I'm trying to think of what the part is because I know I've seen stuff like that, like, all the time on vacuums. It's the same kind of piece, bizarrely. Uh, anyways, so going on here, we end up having Bo, who ends up mentioning, it's like, well, you're in luck. There's sometimes that I often get a lot of shipments at my house rather than actually in the store. So we end up having Wade and Carly who end up going like, oh, okay, well, if this guy just has a piece in the store like this, uh, and he has it at home, like this is kind of convenient. This is great. So like this is a whole lot of rigmarole to go on to here. But like this is the way that this movie just develops. So we have them go to Bo's house. So we end up having Wade, who ends up luckily having to tinkle. He has to go to the bathroom. And we end up having Carly, who goes back into, or stays in the car to wait for the piece so that way they can just get the heck out of there. So we end up having Wade, who is to seemingly so Wade is to go on and try and find the car piece and also just kind of look through this home. And oh, I kind of skipped around about them actually going into the House of Wax. I'll go back to that. So because evidently it seemed really that Wade desperately really wanted to go into this House of Wax because he thought like something could really be cool. We end up having Nick, who in the very beginning of this was like, well, something that looks like something else. Yeah, I guess that's like that'll like fit your wheelhouse, Wade. So, but I kind of want to get to this, and then we'll get back to the House of Wax thing because eventually we'll get there either way. So we go on and we have Wade eventually going through this house, eventually starting to see these like bizarrish wax figures. Eventually, he ends up going into one part of this house where it seems to be some kind of medical wing with all these like old fashioned doctor parts. And so we eventually have Wade, who is to eventually have the house lights eventually turn off. And so we end up having Wade, who is ending up trying to like walk through this house. And so we end up having seemingly Vincent, or who I would assess is quite possibly the villain of this story. We end up having him going and from underneath the floor, like he comes up from the floor, he has this latch where he opens up, and he ends up taking a scissors and cutting uh, Wade's Achilles tendon to where he ends up dropping, and then he ends running off further back into like this medical room, and is starting to like uh, swing these medical pieces back and forth to try to not have someone attack him again, get to him again. But eventually, we end up having it to where eventually Vincent is to go and start to stab Wade and eventually take him down. So we end up having it to where Carly is waiting a fairly long time for Wade. She's like, kind of like, man, like this is taking a while. And so we end up having Bo, who ends up arriving with the car part. And so while Bo is to come on out, we had Carly, who ends up getting out of the car, look around the car, and she has noticed that the busted light was actually from this guy's car, was from Bo's car. So we end up having Carly, who ends up calling Blake and letting her know that Bo, the guy that they trusted, is actually the same guy that was that was after them, that was trying to scare them before. So here's the thing. Here's my problem that I have with this. So Bo is a car repair guy, but he couldn't have fixed his light. I get it to kind of show that this was a bad guy, But I'm sorry, but that is the one huge loophole in my brain noggin that basically says guy who can fix car should have fixed light. But I guess maybe it's like, well, maybe he had to order the part. Maybe that's a rare car part, and maybe that's the reason why he didn't have it. Like that's or maybe he was getting around to fixing it. Blah 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 blah. But still, like it still bugs me that like that guy didn't have a quick, easy fix for that light. That's what bugs me. But it was just a point to show that this guy is a villainous person. So we now have it to where Carly is to have Bo come out, and so we end up having Carly who is to mention to Bo, it's like, well, I'm not gonna come out of here until we have Wade come out and accompany us. And so we end up having Bo who's like, well, come on, like if anything, like this should all be fine. Like so we end up having Carly who ends up blocking both sides of the car, just be like, no, like I'm gonna wait until Wade comes out. So like Wade better come out soon, or like we're not going anywhere. So we eventually have it to where like we end up having Bo who's mentioning like, well, hey, like this seems wrong. Like you're kind of like stealing my car. Like if anything, I'm gonna call the cops on you. And we end up having Carly who's kind of just like go ahead at this point. So we end up having Bo who ends up going and breaking his own window to try to get to Carly, and Carly ends up starting the car, and she ends up trying to drive away from Bo, trying to get away from him. And so we end up having Carly who ends up being fairly successful, but eventually we end up having it to where eventually Bo uh, does get to Carly and eventually does take her to his repair place and eventually does try to do a couple of things. He ends up strapping her on to this bed that they have, and he ends up super gluing her mouth shut to where she can't talk. So, so here's the thing. So now we can put a pin on this moment and go back to the House of Wax thing. So uh, we end up having Carly and Wade going to the House of Wax, and so they end up seeing some kind of very odd and or creepy stuff within this House of Wax. They're kind of surprised how realistic a lot of this stuff is. Also, this place says sorry, we're closed, but they find out a little bit of history of both of supposedly the people that had been there. It seems like the person that had done this House of Wax place became very famous in this town. So, which I guess was fairly odd. Uh, so we eventually find out that it seems that there was some guy who invented this place whose name was actually Vincent, and he had a wife, and it seems that eventually, when Carly and Wade are to ask about the people who had owned this place to Bo, we end up having it to where uh, eventually Bo is to mention that the mother had gotten um, a cyst in her brain that eventually turned her crazy to the point of her uh, going and dying, and eventually we end up having the husband who end up, I guess, taking a shotgun barrel to his head or something, killing himself in some kind of way. So going on, so we and I kind of quickly like I thought I was going to spend more time with Alice the Wax thing, but I didn't. But we end up finding out that it seems that there were uh, some Siamese twins that ended up getting disconjointed within this House of Wax. We end up finding like newspaper clippings and all kinds of stuff. And so we end up having all kinds of bizarrish, like artistic things that are all done by one person named Vincent. And so we eventually see there's all kinds of paintings and and all kinds of things that are all done by Vincent. And we end up having Wade who's like, man, this Vincent guy must have been a really creepy dude, a really just insane like guy. So now we go back into current time. So we end up having Wade, who is to be completely sewn up by this waxed figured man named Vincent. We end up having Vincent sewing. Uh, we end up having Vincent sewing up, of course, Wade's foot and his chest, and so we end up having it to where it seems that Wade cannot move his body. It seems like he had been heavily drugged, to where we end up having Wade who ends up trying to throw his arm to Vincent, but Vincent can just easily bat it away because Wade can't really do anything. So we immediately have it to where Vincent ends up putting Wade uh, into some chair, which ends up spraying hot wax all over his body. And so we are basically just to say that Wade is pretty much dead at this point. Pretty much dead. So, so going on. So we end up having both Dalton and Nick, who end up deciding to go after to try to figure out where Nick and Carly had headed to where we end up having both Blake and Paige, who end up staying back into their tents. I guess they prop all their tents up and they just decide to just like, well, we're gonna sleep in our tents and like you guys can do whatever you want. Because we have it to where really Blake and Paige are desperately wanting their alone time so they could sleep together. So we let's get to the Blake and the Paige stuff, and then eventually we'll get to the Dalton and the Nick stuff. So we eventually have Blake and Paige who are going, and eventually we end up having, of course, Paige, who is doing a strip down for Blake, doing a little dance for him because there's pretty decent music playing. Here's also the funny thing that, speaking of music in this movie, it kind of feels like the music that are in place in this movie was something that they weren't supposed to use, or they were like barely supposed to use. It seems like this movie didn't have like a good enough budget for music in this movie, so they try to like scramble to get any music that they can possibly find. Like there was like this one Disturbed song that barely played for like 10 to 15 seconds, and I was like, okay, like what the heck, like could they have barely used that song, or like why did they just use that part? It makes no sense. So we go on, and so we end up having Blake and Paige who are trying to have this alone time, and so we bizarrely have it to where the music ends up stopping, and so Blake ends up wanting to go out to go and uh, check for the music. And we end up having Paige who's like, well, wait a minute, like, how about we have like a moment and we like talk about something, like, because we end up having Paige who wants to mention that she is going to be quite possibly being pregnant. So we end up having Blake who's like, well, wait a minute, like, let me do the music first and then we can talk all we want. So we end up having Paige who's desperately trying to get Blake to talk, but it just won't work. Blake ends up going out to turn on the music, and while that is to go on, we end up having Blake who ends up getting a knife in the neck, and then ends up, of course, getting killed off. So we end up eventually having Vincent, who is to make his way into Paige's tent. And so also, this Vincent is not the exact same Vincent that was the guy who created this wax museum. Like, in really, like, Vincent, of course, I guess, got his name from his father. So, like, if anything, people might get confused with whatever, but I'm sure this was, like, a generation of a guy that had the same name and, like, carried on his legacy through this guy, through this crazy kid. So we end up having Vincent, who ends up making his way into Paige's tent. We end up having, of course, Paige getting away from said guy, and so we end up having Paige, who ends up scrambling into this location to where eventually we end up having a knife go, because she's on this upper part where it seems like there was like a bit of stairs, and like there was like a place where it seems, well, where Paige was walking through, there was quite a bit of like uh, places where you could kind of insert knives and stuff, because there was plenty of holes where Paige was walking. So we end up having Vincent, who ends up putting a knife through basically Paige's foot, to where eventually we end up having continually knives going through the holes of this uh, like uh, floor of which that Paige is standing on. Because she's kind of like going through this whatever place that it is. It doesn't matter. Pushing on. So we eventually have it to where Paige ends up trying to get a weapon, but all that is really all for naught. We eventually have it to where Vincent eventually gets a weapon himself to eventually toss through a car window to go into Paige's head. And then we end up having Paige, who ends up falling over, and we end up having Vincent, who ends up just taking the back of Paige and pushing this weapon that he had used to kill her. He pushes her head all the way through to the end of this weapon, just pushing her head through this thing. And I'm like, oh my god, that is so awful. So we end up having Vincent recollecting his weapon, and I guess just I guess they really didn't go and try to make wax figures out of these characters, I guess. So we go on, and now we have to talk about both Nick and Dalton, because basically the other two are donezo. Funny enough, we ended up finding out that it seems that Dalton's character worked at being a septic tank guy. So it seems that this guy was used to horrifying smells because he had been a septic tank guy. You would have thought that really then Dalton would not have been complaining about the smell like everyone else was. It's like, dude, I'm used to that kind of thing. So, anyways, we end up having Dalton and Nick having to cross upon uh, the little rocks, like of course Carly and Wade do. We end up having both Dalton and Nick making their way to this town, and so here's the thing. So we we eventually have it. Like I said, Carly is now strapped to some bed at this repair shop, and like she is desperately trying to uh, be able to do something to get out of this uh, chair slash table that she's in. And eventually she ends up breaking out of it, and eventually she ends up going on to try to desperately try to get someone's attention. So we we have it to where seemingly Dalton and Nick are to make their way through this town, and we end up having Dalton, who ends up going through the House of Wax, and we end up having Nick, who ends up going to the repair shop. So we end up having Bo, who ends up hearing Nick making it to this repair shop. We end up having Bo, who ended up turning up the music before, to eventually, I guess, have it be that he's just trying to creep Carly out, or trying to, if anyone were to come to this town, uh, like they wouldn't have heard the screamings of Carly, I guess. So we eventually have it to where Bo ends up appearing in front of Nick, and we end up having Nick, who is asking like, "Hey, did you see a Carly or a Wade by chance? Like they were making their way to here to get a car part." And so we end up having Bo is like, yeah, I've never seen anybody today, and like, and I've been here all day, and we end up having Nick going like, well, are you sure? Because like, if anything, like, if any, I had made my way here, and I've been waiting here for a while for anyone to show up, and so we eventually have it to where Carly is desperately trying to get Nick's attention because, bizarrely, where she is at, it seems like she is a sewer cover away from getting to have Nick hear her. So we end up having Carly, who ends up having to forcibly try and put a finger into the hole of this little sewer-esh like opening, and so she's to try to put her finger there, and we end up having Bo notice this, and he ends up trying to cover it up or try to cut Carly's finger off. So we end up now having Carly, who ends up now having to rip her lips open so that way she can scream for Nick to help her. So she ends up doing so, and we end up having Nick, who ends up trying to take down Bo, and eventually he does so. And so we end up having Nick, who ends up making his way to, or no, Nick ends up kind of scrambling to close the repair shop to where Bo cannot get to him. So we have it to where eventually Nick ends up going into ends up going to Carly and try to help her and try to like nurse some of her wounds. Ba 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 ba. So we end up having Carly, who ends up going and telling Nick that the people in the town here aren't actually real. Eventually, we end up having eventually Carly, who is to eventually go through the church and realize that the people that are in there aren't actually people. She ends up going through and trying to like ask people to help her, and none of them are actually real. All of them are already dead or just kind of hanging on to life. So we end up eventually having at some point Carly, who ends up bumping into one of these wax people, and just the arm just falls off. She's like, "Oh my god!" And so eventually, when Bo ends up appearing into the church, she ends up trying to hide from him, but she can't hide from him forever. So, and eventually, we end up having. Eventually, Carly mentioned that she thought she had seen one person who ended up opening a window before, but actually, Nick and Carly end up finding out that that was just a fake wax figure too. So, what ends up happening to Dalton? So Dalton ends up going into this wax museum, and eventually he ends up finding a person who he thinks is Wade. So we end up having Dalton, who ends up looking at Wade and is like, "Hey man, like we need to get out of here." But then we end up having Dalton realize how non-lifelike that Wade actually is, and that he isn't talking, and so we end up having Dalton like going, "Oh my god, like Wade, like you're a wax figure. Like, hey, maybe all I need to do is just start to like peel this stuff off of you, and maybe you'll be fine." But we end up having it to where Dalton starts taking off Wade's like actual skin, and we just start seeing blood, and we just start seeing bone, and Dalton's like, "Oh my god, I'm sorry," but he keeps like pulling off, and he's like, "Oh my god, I'm sorry." And so we end up having like Wade, who is just in like tears and crying and whatever. And so we eventually have Dalton, who has Vincent, who is chasing after him. So we end up having uh, Dalton, who ends up trying to scramble to go down these steps, and he ends up instead falling down these steps. And we end up having Vincent, who ends up going down into these steps to eventually just chop off Dalton's head, and now Dalton is dead. I think at some point we end up having Nick and Carly going and finding Dalton seemingly a wax-like figure that is attached to this chair. Nick ends up trying to figure out how to get him out of this chair, and he ends up just cracking and taking off his head. Which he's like, "Oh well, I'm sorry, man. Like I thought I was trying to help you, but you're dead." So we go on, and so we eventually have it to where seemingly the only two that are left are Nick and Carly. It's also kind of funny to know that Nick and Carly were twins, uh, were twins together, and it is kind of funny we end up having Bo and Vincent, who are conjoined twins as well. Then we end up finding out that they were conjoined to the face, and we end up having Vincent, who ends up having to wear a mask for the rest of his life, a waxed mask for the rest of his life, because uh, really he had been disfigured from the procedure. So we we end up having twins going after twins. Isn't that kind of funny? Isn't that weird? So we eventually have it to where Nick and Carly are forced to have to fight it out with both Wade and or both Bo and Vincent. So we end up having both Nick and Carly, who are trying to hide it out in the town to try to avoid Bo. It seems that Bo ends up getting a shotgun, so we end up having both Nick and Carly, who end up going and hiding into the movie theater. To where eventually we end up having Bo, who ends up trying to scan the audience to eventually find uh, these people. We end up having Nick, who ends up finding a crossbow before they are to go into the theater. And so when we have Bo, who ends up starting to figure out or remember which person is fake and what is the real person, he ends up trying to like count out to figure out which one was the real person and how many should be in this theater. And so we eventually have it to where Bo is kind of going to the very front of this movie theater and look around to see if there's any actual real people there. And so we eventually have Bo spotting Carly, and so Carly ends up running off, and Bo tries to go after her, and we end up having Nick, who ends up shooting the crossbow into seemingly into Bo's arm and then into Bo's heart. So we end up having seemingly Bo taken down, but we would be wrong. So we eventually have it to where uh, Nick and Carly are to go back into, I believe, Bo's home. So we go along and we end up having eventually Bo and Vincent making it back to their home. We end up having Bo, who ends up taking the one arrow from out of his arm, and then eventually tries to snap one of the other arrows, but doesn't completely pull it out of his heart. So we end up having Vincent, who makes it back into the home, and so we end up having both Bo and Vincent arguing. Well, really, Bo is doing most of the talking. Vincent isn't really saying anything, and so we end up having Vincent, who is trying to like correct his face, and we end up having Bo, who ends up giving Vincent crap, but then eventually he ends up saying like, "Well, hey, like, uh, remember what Mom said that if anything, like, your talents would be able to make up for your slights, your problems, your whatever." And so we eventually have it to where eventually Nick and Carly are eventually to be spotted, and so we end up having Vincent uh, and Bo going after these people. So we push on, and we eventually have it to where reasonably uh, Nick and Carly are pushed to go into the House of Wax, and eventually they end up finding a body that they end up sadly deheading. And so we eventually have it to where we go on and we have seemingly we end up having these people eventually go and kill Bo off, and then eventually we end up having Vincent, who is trying to scramble to get to Carly and Nick, and so we end up having it to where we end up having them uh, like getting stabbed by Vincent, but then eventually we end up having Carly, who ends up having this baseball bat that she ended up just pummeling Bo to death with this baseball bat. That's how he died. And we end up having Carly, who is hiding in this room, while we end up having this House of Wax slowly but surely starting to melt. Because eventually they start to have this House of Wax start to become on fire. And so we end up going on to eventually have Vincent, who is fighting with Nick. We end up having Carly, who ends up having to re-break into this room because we end up having Vincent, who ends up breaking into the room that Carly was in, and then eventually Carly ends up leaving the room. She ends up coming back into the room to eventually go and take the knife that was from Nick to eventually stab Vincent. And so we eventually have it to where this whole room that they're in is completely and utterly falling apart. We end up having these characters eventually fall down a floor. To where eventually we end up having Vincent, who ends up falling upon the body of Bo, and they are to just end up dying together. So we end up having Nick and Carly, who are just trying to scramble to try and get out of this House of Wax, to where this house is slowly but surely falling apart. So like, it's kind of interesting when Wade first got to this House of Wax, realizing that this entire environment was actually made out of wax. So we end up having this whole House of Wax museum slowly but surely starting to crumble, almost in a poltergeist-like fashion. So coincidentally, we end up having both Carly and Nick kind of realizing that there's a wall that they can start pulling away from to try to get out of here. And so we end up having them trying to get out of here as quickly possible to realize that they have been able to poke their way out of the House of Wax symbol of this museum. And so we end up having them trying to push their way out of here. While that is going on, we end up seeing slowly but surely the House of Wax symbol starting to droop and fall, to where eventually, while they are to coincidentally in perfect timing get out of this House of Wax symbol and or house, we end up having the coincidentally them getting to the lowest part where they can just kind of crawl out because they hit the grassy part of this building. And so we eventually have this building who ends up just burning up. And so we have it to where the cops end up arriving after this because both villains are dead. And so we end up having it to where the cops didn't even know that this place or this town actually existed. If there wasn't a fire going on within this town, they wouldn't have known anything was going on. And so, evidently, this place was completely and utterly deserted, and they didn't know any better. So, we end up having both Nick and Carly ending up, trudging away. And so, we end up finding out, seemingly one of the police officers realized that it seems that Bo and Vincent, they weren't just twins. It seems like there were three brothers. And I guess the very last brother was actually the Roadkill Driver. I guess to show to us that quite possibly there could have been a sequel after this, but I couldn't see rationally in my head there ever actually being a sequel. I can understand there quite possibly being a reboot, but I can't see there being a sequel. Plus, also, I wouldn't know if anybody would want this to actually have a sequel to it. But then again, maybe people did like this film. Maybe people did enjoy it. The gruesome kills of it all. Yeah. So with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this film. Yeah, it's like going into this, I thought that this movie was at some point interesting, but a lot of it was just like, come on already. So I think that's all that I wanted to say was, come on with this movie. Come on. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, everybody.